Boldwood presents Breaking the Ice, written by Amy Andrews and read by Kate Hanford. Chapter 1. Hello. Beck? Hey, babe. Samantha Evans wiped her nose on a tissue, inordinately pleased her sister was home at the exact time her life had decided to fall apart. Are you crying? What's wrong? You never cry. Hang on for a sec. Hot tears welled in Sam's eyes again as Beck yelled at her girls to turn the television down. General protesting could be heard, but Beck overruled it all with threats to cancel their much-coveted summer camp plans, and the background noise dulled. Okay, tell me what happened, and who do I need to beat up? Samantha could barely raise a smile at Beck's "don't mess with my sister" act. I ran into Gary at a company function last night. What was god-awful Gary doing at a High Flyers event? That's a bit energetic for him. He was there with a woman from a rival firm. They're getting married. She's pregnant. I thought Gary didn't believe in marriage and kids. So did I. There was a moment of sisterly silence. Okay, but Gary's a rat who dumped you 12 months ago in the middle of the tax season and gave you lousy sex, and we hates him, remember? Why are you crying over that loser now? Because something strange happened last night. I suddenly realized I'm Sally. Beck's sigh was loud in Sam's ear. Ugh, babe, you really gotta stop watching that movie. You are Sam, and it is just a movie. No, see, Sally had a point. Samantha's voice wobbled. It wasn't that Gary didn't want to get married and have kids. He just didn't want to do it with me. Okay, I don't know who this is, but you better put me on to my sister. Right now, Beck joked. You know, the single-minded career girl, hell-bent on a corner office. Samantha didn't say anything, too depressed by her sister's summation of her life. Since when is marriage and children part of your equation? It's not. They're not, she denied. But then, last night, a hard ball of emotion lodged in Sam's throat. Why didn't he want to marry me? What's the matter with me, Beck? Nothing's the matter with you. You've just been a little too focused on your career to notice your appalling taste in men. You're right. I'm too career-oriented. I get up, I go to work, I come home late, I feed Godzilla, I go to bed. God, she groaned. I'm so boring. No, you work hard. Of course you're tired at the end of the day. You're sensible. I'm staid. You're reliable. Sam groaned inwardly. Oh, God. I sound like a Volvo. I suck. No, babe, your life sucks. That's different. Samantha could always count on Beck to tell it like it was, and she sniffed at the truth in her sister's words. Being a good girl all her life, studying hard, working frenetically, climbing the ladder, hadn't left her much time for a life. For goodness sake, her two closest relationships were with an octogenarian bookshop owner and an obese fish. Sure, she'd almost reached the pinnacle of her career, was financially secure and living the life of a young, urban, modern woman. Supposedly. She was exactly where she wanted to be. So why did it suddenly feel so lonely? Sounds to me like running into Gary tripped your clock. Your eggs have decided it's time to fulfill their biological purpose. My eggs? Sure. If you listen closely, I bet you'll hear them cheeping. Cheeping? Crap. That was all she needed, noisy eggs. I don't have time in my life for cheeping eggs, Beck. How do I make it go away? Find a man and have some babies. Impossible? I'm overseeing the Adams account until 2029. Beck laughed. They can be demanding critters. Might be hard to sleep over the noise. Samantha could hear her nieces laughing in the background and was hit by a sudden desire to hug them close and kiss their sweet faces. They'd grown up so much, but she could still remember holding them as newborns, marveling at their fingers and perfect bow mouths. I suppose I could rejig my schedule. Get Adams done earlier, say 2027? Cheeping eggs wait for no man, Beck insisted. Not even Mr. Adams, and you can't slot love and babies around a career that consumes your every waking moment. Why not? If she must be afflicted with mutinous eggs, why couldn't she have both? Plenty of women hold down jobs and have babies. I've worked too hard to sacrifice my career because my eggs have taken temporary leave of their senses. I mean, I'm organized and efficient. I regularly juggle multi-million-dollar accounts. It can't be harder than that, surely. Beck snorted. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Babies don't fit in well with work schedules. In fact, they throw up over your Donna Karan suit just before you leave the house. I'll get a nanny. Babe, you're a perfectionist who sucks at delegation. You won't want a nanny. Sam heard the conviction in her sister's voice and knew she was right. She hated delegating because no one could do her job like she could. Why didn't you tell me being 30 was this hard? I thought you were fine with turning the big 30. I am. I just didn't know my ovaries were going to revolt. This wasn't in my plan. Maybe it's time for a new plan? Samantha blew her nose. I like the old one. Well, life has a way of throwing egg in your face when we least expect it. Sam groaned at her sister's bad pun. Is it too late to become vegan? The second blow came a week later. Birdie died. Samantha stood outside the bookshop in total disbelief. This morning, when she'd passed by, it was business as usual, and Birdie had waved at her. This afternoon, an ambulance, a police car, and a coroner's van had greeted her as she'd rounded the corner. And Birdie was gone. What happened? Samantha asked Dulcie Reardon, her arm automatically going around the stooped old shoulders of another of Birdie's faithful customers. Heart attack, Dulcie whispered. Dulcie, no spring chicken herself, leaned heavily into Samantha, her hand over her mouth, and they stood and watched as two official-looking men pushed a trolley loaded with a black body bag and slid it into the back of the waiting vehicle. Samantha's regulation cup of hot chocolate from Starbucks grew cold, completely forgotten. Just like that, in a flash, life could be over. What was she going to do without Birdie? Every morning, every afternoon, every weekend for 5 years, the old lady had been a part of her life. But more than that, Eddie Hawke, Birdie to her friends, had been an institution around the glassworks area of Tetworth for over 50 years. The glassworks, so called after the old glass factories that had once sprawled and thrived here, was one of the older, more socio-economically flatlined areas of the city. But the residents didn't seem to mind. Many had never lived anywhere else, harking back to an era where entire neighborhoods were employed by the one company. Today, the once grand aesthetics had faded, the boulevards now pockmarked and the buildings erected to support a flourishing industry were now scruffy around the edges. But the people remained the same, resilient and pragmatic. Like Birdie, who had operated her beloved second-hand romance bookshop from the corner of the now shabby arcade that occupied the ground level of the apartment building both Birdie and Samantha called home. How many Sundays had she spent in Birdie's, combing the shelves for her favorite romance novels? Who else but Birdie knew or even cared about her passion for Rita Summers books and her pirate heroes? Who else but Birdie would keep them aside especially for her as customers traded them in? How many times had Birdie cooked her a hot dinner, dished up the most divine food along with her bumper sticker advice? Birdie had dispensed her homespun wisdom as easily as the mints she kept near the cash register, and Samantha had loved her for it. Sure, Beck was good at it too, but she was a busy mom with 4 kids who lived 1,000 miles away in Denver. Birdie had been just downstairs and had always made time. But not anymore. It didn't seem right the next morning to come out of the sliding doors and see Birdie's shop all shut up. Samantha stopped in front of the pristine, highly polished glass, still feeling the loss. Birdie had been up with the sparrows every day of her life, and it didn't seem to matter how early Samantha left for work. The shop was always open. But there were no lights, no movement, no little wave to start her day on the right foot. Just her somber reflection. She eyed herself critically, as she always did, because decades of diet culture and internalized fat shaming were damn hard to shake. Some days she was better at it. Today was not one of those days. A Chanel business suit-clad plain Jane stared back at her. Plain brown hair, which she twisted back every morning into a knot at her nape. Average height, way too hippie, with some chunk in those thighs. 0 gap. Samantha had battled her body image since her junior high gym teacher had questioned whether she wanted to eat a second piece of funnel cake, and not even her 4-inch patent jade slingback chews were enough to beat it this morning. Or maybe that was just her eggs talking, murmuring their disapproval at the very image of an independent, career-focused woman. For once, the majestic heritage oak trees she passed on her way to the bus stop didn't register. Even the sight of the PE finance building coming into view 15 minutes later, its reflective glass panels dazzling like a mirror ball in the sunshine, failed to rouse her flagging spirits. In fact, the buzz she normally felt at just being in the city didn't materialize at all. Stepping off the bus, Samantha rounded the corner, the gentle river breeze lacking its usual ability to give her a lift. The building's exclusive River Plaza address had been a badge of honor only a week ago. But today, as she entered the ornate foyer, it felt as empty and as cold as the slabs of Italian marble clicking beneath her designer heels. She spent the morning in meetings with 2 of the firm's most high-powered clients. As the youngest senior accounts executive on staff, she had done well for herself, something she tried to reflect on as she stood at the window of her 11th floor office, taking in the other buildings nearby. It was unusual for a city the size of Tetworth, population 80,000, to have a half-dozen high-rises dotting the CBD landscape. But its proximity to both LA and San Francisco made it popular with corporations looking for a happy medium between commuting distances and skyrocketing building rental. Not that PE finance need worry about that, given it was one of the planet's most prestigious investment agencies. Despite having offices in multiple countries, its global HQ was in Tetworth because that's where Percival Eddinghauser originally founded the company 120 years ago, and tradition meant something to the still family-run firm. A twinkle of sunshine on the river caught Samantha's eye, and her gray gaze tracked a river ferry speeding its ant-like passengers to the other side. This was what she'd wanted. This was what she'd worked so hard to achieve. Yes, the incident with Gary had thrown her, and Bertie's death had whammied her, but there was no need to let them knock her off track. She had arrived, damn it. More than arrived. She was one step away from a coveted corner office on the 12th floor, and there was no way she was going to let recalcitrant eggs derail her. There was only one thing that could do that. "Sam, can I talk to you about something?" And his name was Ray. Reluctantly, she dragged her gaze away from the view, turning to see the bane of her life, the boss's moronic nephew, of distant Eddinghauser stock, standing in her doorway looking as clueless as ever. Today of all days, she wanted to say, "Ray, you are a fuckwit. Go away." But she didn't. Instead, she sighed and nodded at the man who had been nothing but a complete pain in the ass since he'd wheedled his way into his uncle's favor a year ago. He'd been incompetent from the get-go. She'd been picking up his slack and fixing his stuff-ups for long enough now to know that nepotism was the only way he was ever going to be employable. And he had made no secret of the fact that he wanted her job. It was almost laughable to think Ray could even covet a job that was as complex and responsible as hers, but the old man did have a blind spot where he was concerned. He wandered in, his gaze glued, as always, to her breasts, and Sam turned back to the window to see tiny passengers disembarking from the ferry. And for the first time since she'd come to work here almost a decade ago, she wished she was down there, with the little people, instead of in her office with the stupid people. Chapter 2. Samantha hung back under the shade of a massive maple tree and waited for Bertie's clan to leave the graveside. The bright summer foliage provided welcome shelter from the warmth of the sun, and its gnarled, aged branches pointed knotted fingers over the undulating terrain. The scent of freshly turned earth infused her senses as Samantha admired the grandeur of the Victorian headstones, standing in stark contrast to the simplicity of more modern sites. Tetworth Cemetery, a stone's throw from the CBD, was hemmed in by 3 major thoroughfares. Despite the everyday mortal rush and hurry beyond the ornamental stone gates, it somehow managed to remain tranquil. Presiding over the city like a grand old dame, its imposing elevated position and spires of crosses and other holy iconography, rising from atop moss-covered gravestones, projected an otherworldly serenity. It was entirely fitting that Eddie Hawke, herself a true lady, was laid to rest here. Samantha patiently eyed the large family-only gathering. She guessed it was inevitable, given the size of the Hawke clan and how many had stayed in Tetworth, that there would be a cast of thousands. Bertie did, after all, raise 7 sons, and all her boys had gone forth and multiplied. Her youngest son had even had 7 sons of his own. And they were a close-knit bunch. Samantha knew from how often family members popped into the shop, and from witnessing their easy affection, that Eddie had been much adored. There always seemed to be a son or daughter-in-law, or a grandchild or great-grandchild dropping by. Samantha even recognized a few, as she'd waited for them to depart. She'd already done a quick scan for Nick, the 7th son of the 7th son. Of course, he wasn't among them, but she guessed nobody expected him to be. Bertie's youngest grandchild, the apple of her eye, as well as Samantha's and Bertie's occasional neighbor, was a pro hockey player in the NHL for the New Brunswick Crabbers. Nick Hawkeye Hawke had not long had knee surgery on his blown ACL, which had put a premature end to his season and to the Crabbers making the playoffs. Not that she followed his career that closely. Nope. She wasn't into sport, or just generally into watching Mr. I'm Too Sexy for My Hockey Pants do anything. He had plenty of adoring women to keep his ego stroked, as was evident in the tabloids and in the comings and goings from his apartment whenever he was back in Tetworth during the off-season. Their relationship consisted of running into each other in the elevator or foyer or at their doors, once or twice at the bookshop, during which time they exchanged brief pleasantries, and she kept her ridiculous, futile, one-sided crush on him completely to herself. Did she occasionally succumb to the porn that was #hockey players in suits on TikTok to catch a glimpse of him? Yes. Because a guy in a suit was her catnip, and try as she might, she still couldn't wrap her head around the fact that Birdie had a grandson that looked like the hot guy from Friday Night Lights. Did she watch him get his pretty face and lovely bones ground into the ice on the regular? She did not. It was Birdie that kept her up to date on all things Hawkeye. The family eventually left, en masse, and when the last car had pulled away, Samantha approached Birdie's final resting place. Bert's, her beloved husband who had died 10 years ago, neatly kept headstone, lay faithfully beside it, and a lump rose in Samantha's throat. Birdie was finally back with her soulmate. She took a few steadying breaths, struggling for composure. Would she ever find a true love like Bert and Eddie's? Tears welled in her eyes, and she dashed them away. 10 years ago, the only love affair she'd entertained was with Mr. Adams and his company's very fat books. What the hell was the matter with her? Damn it, she shouldn't have come. She should have known that a regal old cemetery full of love stories in her frame of mind was a dumb idea. But it just didn't seem right to let Birdie go without a final goodbye. She hadn't got the chance to say it before the massive heart attack claimed her in her beloved shop, and she wanted to pay her respects. More tears formed in her eyes, and she blinked them away, cranky with herself. Birdie wouldn't have wanted her to cry over her grave. Of that, she was certain. But she just couldn't seem to stem the flow. What am I going to do without you, Birdie? Samantha was going to miss their chats and Birdie's wonderful, cackling laughter. The bookshop had been her haven from the pressures of work. She loved her job, but it could be super stressful. Who else was she going to vent to about that? And whine to about the removal of the vending machines from every floor to encourage healthier food consumption, thereby denying her of her afternoon sugar fix? Who else was she going to bitch to about smug, smarmy Ray? Nick Hawke was late. The flight from Toronto got in behind schedule, and he knew there was no point asking the Uber driver to hurry when the wheels had touched down on the tarmac half an hour after the funeral was scheduled to begin. And besides, Birdie would understand. She'd been the epitome of easy come, easy go. Absently, he rubbed at his left knee as he exited the Uber. He was 2 weeks post-surgery and was able to walk without aid or require a brace, but it still hurt like a son of a bitch. He'd take some painkillers when he got to the wake. Hauling his tatty, faithful rucksack out of the trunk, he propped it against a nearby headstone as the Uber drove away. He could have used any of the dozen bags he'd been given by sponsors, but he remained stubbornly attached to this one. Birdie had given it to him 20 years ago when he'd been first drafted to the San Jose Sharks at the age of 18. It was fitting that he should return home with it at her final send-off. Nick looked around and saw a woman standing by the only freshly dug grave he could see. Samantha Evans. Given he didn't spend a lot of time in Tetworth, he'd never had much to do with the woman who lived in the apartment next door. But he'd know that curvy silhouette anywhere, and the sheared bodice of her plain black dress did nothing to hide it today. If he couldn't already tell by the movement of her shoulders that she was crying, her muted sobs blew toward him on the gentle breeze. and part of him almost hung back. Maybe she wanted privacy? But her solitude, her wretchedness, compelled him to seek her out. His grandmother had touched many people in different ways, and he knew Samantha and Bertie had developed a close friendship. He approached slowly, not wanting to intrude on her grief, but to unite with her in it and maybe give her some comfort. Fishing around in his pocket, he grabbed his handkerchief, the white lace looking delicate in his meat-cleaver hands. Gently, he nudged her arm with it as he drew level. She started at the touch. "Nick?" Gray eyes rimmed with red blinked in obvious surprise. "When did you get in?"
30 minutes ago. My plane was 2 hours late."
He offered her the hanky again, and she stared at it absently as she took it. "You carry around a white lace hanky?"
"Bertie gave it to me at the first pro match I ever played."
He shrugged.
"It's my lucky charm."
The fact he'd accidentally left it behind for the game where he'd fucked his knee only proved the superstition further. "Thanks," she whispered, her voice husky as she dabbed her eyes and blew her nose. Nick turned his attention to the soil-sprinkled coffin, aware of the brush of their arms as they stood in silent contemplation. "It's a shame you missed the funeral," she said eventually. It was. He'd have liked to have been here, but...
"It's okay," he assured. "Bertie would understand."
She didn't challenge his assertion. She just said, "Yeah." Another minute of silent reflection passed before she roused herself. "I'll go." She shot him a wan smile. "Give you some alone time with your grandmother." Nick nodded.
"I'll see you around. I'm looking after the shop for the next 4 months, till the family make more permanent arrangements."
She did that blinking thing again, as the smile dissolved. "You're going to run the bookshop?" He laughed. He couldn't help it. She looked like she'd just stepped in dog poo. "You?" she repeated, like it was the most absurd thing she'd ever heard.
"Yes. Me. It'll give me something to do in between physio sessions."
The chances at his age that he'd be fit for the September training camp and the start of the season were minuscule. He'd done his right knee when he'd been 22, and that had required an intense 6 months of recovery. But the fact he was being written off, that his injury was being talked about as career-ending, had only put a fire in his belly. He may be 38, but he was still playing excellent hockey, and he would decide when to hang up his blades, not anyone else. She, however, was still staring at him, aghast.
"What?" he asked.
"What the hell do you know about running a second-hand romance bookshop?" Nick chuckled at her disparaging tone, like she didn't believe he was remotely capable of anything other than whacking a puck across the ice. He tisked. "You shouldn't judge a book by its cover, Samantha Evans." If glaring was an Olympic sport, she'd have just taken gold. Hell, if she'd been capable of shooting fire from her eyes, he'd be a flaming human torch right now. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Just great." Then she stomped off, leaving Nick not entirely sure why she was mad at him, but pretty sure that he liked it. Chapter 3. There were protesters outside Samantha's office building when she arrived the next morning, which was about all she needed after yesterday's bombshell from Nick. She was still stewing over that announcement. Nick Hawke running the bookshop. Her bookshop. What would Mr. Look at My Stick Control know about romance novels? What the hell did he know about Rita Summers? How was she going to converse with Hawkeye for hours about fictional pirates, as she and Bertie had done? How could he possibly understand the sheer bliss of completely losing yourself in the swoon-worthy stories? The man looked like he'd sprung from one of the goddamn pages, and yesterday had been no exception. He'd been all tall and broad and ruggedly sexy, with his 3-day growth somehow managing to emphasize rather than hide that distractingly sexy chin cleft. His scruffily rumpled, long, dark hair was pushed back off his face, making him look like Fabio and Henry Cavill's love child. Really, was it fair for one guy to monopolize every single desirable physical trait gifted to man? Was it not enough to be a highly paid jock, to have $1 million sponsorship deals thrown at you without adding, looks like a screen god? Christ on a cracker. Was the entire world going crazy? First Gary, then her eggs, then Bertie, and now Nick, who played sports in her shop. The protesters were carrying placards and yelling about the shady business dealings of their newest oil company client. Samantha had objected through the normal channels when PE Finance had been considering their business. It wasn't like they needed the money, and she felt strongly about PE being a good corporate citizen, because, by and large, they were. She had garnered some important support within the company, but ultimately PE had decided to take on the new client, which was another reason why she wanted to keep moving up, so her voice carried more and more weight in the decision-making process. She loved working for PE, but it swung older and very much penis-oriented at the top. They needed some youth and diversity to really put them into the best position going forward. This decision being a good case in point. A young guy with dreadlocks handed her a pamphlet as she pushed through the ragtag crowd. She read it as the elevator ushered her in efficient silence to her floor, the usual ills staring back at her in bold, angry pen strokes. Shady deals to countries with even shadier leaders. Their dealings in misinformation campaigns, contribution to climate change, which was not only killing the planet, but everyone on it, including helpless babies. Babies. Samantha's stomach lurched, and she swallowed as her eggs wept. The elevator pinged open, and Samantha made a direct line for the CEO's corner office for their regular morning meeting. "Bob," she greeted as she entered. "Sammy!" he boomed, waving her over to the window where he was standing. Samantha had never been enamored with his insistence on infantilizing her name. Sammy sounded like such a little girl. After 5 years, she barely registered it anymore, but for some reason, this morning it was exceptionally irritating. Joining him at his floor-to-ceiling window, she looked down at what he was muttering over. The protesters swarmed like ants around the bottom of the building. "Goddamn rent-a-crowd," he growled. "All we're trying to do up here is earn an honest living. I bet that's something they wouldn't know the first thing about." "I did warn the board this would happen," Samantha said, handing over the pamphlet. He looked at it disparagingly and then crumpled it up. "What our clients do is none of our business. We invest their money, get them the best tax advantages money can buy, and keep them happy." "We could make it our business," she murmured. "You know these guys are going to screw up somewhere at some point to the detriment of the environment. Then what do I tell my kids when they ask me why I didn't—" "Kids?" Bob interrupted with a splutter. He gaped at her, and Samantha couldn't really blame him. Where the hell had that come from? Were her eggs controlling her mouth now? Bob stood there doing a very good impression of a fish out of water before he launched into his tirade.
You stood here in this very office 5 years ago and swore black and blue that you didn't want kids."
Samantha sighed. It was true. She had. He hadn't asked her outright, but she'd sensed Bob had been prevaricating, and she'd taken a punt that it was her reproductive potential that was making him reticent. Of course, it was questionable, not to mention illegal, to use her age to discriminate against her in an interview situation. But it hadn't mattered at the time. She'd wanted the job, and she sure as hell hadn't wanted children. "You're right." She nodded. "I didn't. I don't. It's just... my eggs have started talking to me. I think my clock has suddenly started ticking." He stared at her, clearly mystified by the statement, something over which she could empathize. She didn't really understand what was happening either. "Don't worry," she assured. "I'm having a bad couple of days. Forget it." Samantha made a mental note to see her gynecologist about having her eggs surgically removed as she left his office. Bob's secretary buzzed after lunch, and she responded to the summons without the usual spring in her step.
"I want you to take some leave."
Samantha would have laughed at Bob's no-nonsense, no-beating-around-the-bush method if he hadn't been so serious. I beg your pardon?" What the hell was this?
"You're obviously a little stressed and not nearly as focused as you should be. I've checked. You haven't taken any annual leave in the last 5 years. Take it now. Come back when the eggs have stopped talking."
Samantha couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Are you sacking me?" She'd had one tiny blip in her focus, and he'd terminated her employment?
"Of course not," he boomed. "But I'll not lie to you, Sammy. I need someone who's more than just a damn good accountant. I need someone who's going to play the game. Someone who can give me 110%. Kids, Sammy, they shift a woman's focus. You need to have a good hard think about your priorities."
"I can't leave. I have 5 active accounts and 3 more in the pipeline worth tens of millions of dollars."
"Ray can handle it."
And that was when Samantha got it. This wasn't about her focus or her leave or even her eggs. This was about the golden-haired boy. Bile rose hot and acidic in her throat. She was being put on leave under some ridiculous pretense to make way for the company douchebag. "Ray cannot handle it," she said through gritted teeth. "Ray is a fuckwit."
"Of course he can. You've taught him well. And when you're better, he'll be top-notch."
Samantha snapped. Ray could kiss her ass. "No, Bob. No way, no how, no deal. It's Ray or me. Ray or me. I will not be replaced by an incompetent fool, and I will not be part of a company or any deals where our names appear together."
"I think you need to be very careful here."
Bob's voice lowered a degree. "Huh, fat chance." If Bob thought she was going to sit silently while his nephew used her hard work and reputation to get a leg up, then he could think again. Or what? You'll fire me instead of asking me to take leave? Well, you know what? You can stuff your job, but mark my words. She rose from her chair, jabbing her finger at the desk. I'll be back. And do you know why? Because when your dim-witted nephew destroys years of my hard work and loses this company millions of dollars, you're going to come crawling back. And you'd better be prepared to eat humble pie because I'm going to enjoy every minute of it.
There's no need to get all hysterical, Sammy. I'm not sacking you.
He was using what she assumed was his placatory voice, while displaying that stricken look men often got when women went all female on them. Like he was expecting her to burn her bra or say the word vagina, or worse, cry. Too bad. Because I quit. It's me or him, Bob. Bob shifted uncomfortably. Ray will be fine. Samantha shook her head. Bob really couldn't see his nephew for what he was. Ray is a lazy, useless slug. Goodbye, Bob. Samantha strode to her office and slammed the door. How dare he choose Ray over her? That old fool. She emptied out a box of printer paper and threw her desk items into it. A photo of Beck and the girls, a paperweight that Jess, her niece, had made in kindergarten, her nameplate, a stack of Post-it notes. Strictly speaking, they weren't hers, but considering she was owed a corner office, Bob was getting off cheap. Besides, you could never have enough Post-its. There was a knock on her door, and she growled at the intruder to go away. What? No longer Uncle Bob's blue-eyed girl? Samantha's head snapped up as slack-jawed Ray lounged in her doorway. She looked at the faux innocent smile and seriously contemplated murder for the first time in her life. It was only the thought of being cooped up in a cell with her baby-crazy eggs for company 23 hours a day that stopped her from testing the crack-resistant properties of her window. In her mood, she didn't doubt she could hurl the little weasel through the bulletproof glass. Don't you have a company to bankrupt? She said through gritted teeth. Ray chuckled as he moved into the room and came to a halt in front of her desk. Sammy, Sammy, Sammy. He curled his hands into fists, placing his knuckles on the wood and leaning in. You always did underestimate me. Samantha blinked as Ray's veneer fell away before her, and she saw a cold, calculating light frost his gaze. Suddenly, she saw it all. His vacant stare replaced by a razor-sharp alertness, his hapless grin traded for a shark-like grimace, his keen, eager puppy expression lost to a take-no-prisoners sneer. She shivered at the utter cunning of it all. He'd been playing her. He'd had an agenda all along, and that was to force her out. Unfortunately for Ray, she'd seen his work, and figures didn't lie. He may be scoring an A in scheming, but he was pulling a big fat F with numbers. A fistful of conniving didn't compensate for a shitload of dumb. I give you 6 months. Ray laughed as he pushed away from the desk and strutted to the window. You know, Samantha, I could speak with Uncle Bob. Put in a good word. He turned his gaze from the view to her. Of course, I would expect you to be grateful. Samantha took a moment to compute the latest twist in the mind-bending saga that was Ray, who was looking at her breasts like they were covered in whipped cream and sprinkled with nuts. He was seriously going to add sexual harassment to his list of incredibly dumb things to do at work? Her eggs shuddered as she picked up her box. I'd rather be unemployed for the rest of my life. The protesters dropped their placards and cheered as she walked out, box in her arms. It was obvious to them she was leaving, and they congratulated her for her courage. She felt like a fraud, but their cheers lifted her spirits after the enormity of what she'd done, and the enormity of the unknown she was launching herself into. Hit big time. Great. Now what the hell was she going to do? Have a baby. Oh, shut up, eggs, she ordered. As for the first time in her adult life, She walked into the great unknown. Chapter 4. "I'm getting a tattoo," Sam announced as soon as Beck picked up the phone. "So, your fear of needles has improved, then?" "I'm not frightened of needles." "You fainted when you took Jess to the hospital for her stitches last year?" "It was a big needle." "And tattoos aren't?" "No. They're little needles." "Lots of little needles." Samantha gulped as her forehead grew uncomfortably warm. "Just breathe. You can do this. You can do this." "Sounds like you don't approve?" "I approve wholeheartedly. Good on you, I say. Maybe just a little puzzled as to why suddenly you would do something so out of character?" "I've just had some time on my hands to think lately, and I realize that I've been so busy having a career that I've missed out on life a bit." "A bit?" "Sam, the world could have exploded into a massive fireball, and I doubt you'd have noticed. Haven't I been telling you you've needed a life for years?" "Well, yes, you have. Which is why I'm taking your advice and living a bit. I mean, where has working hard got me? Replaced by a moronic, yuppie 22-year-old with a string of beige boyfriends to my name? I'm boring, Beck. Time to make some changes." "Sing it, sister." "I'm making a to-do list." "Imagine my surprise," Beck mocked good-naturedly. Samantha knew what Beck thought of her obsessive list-keeping, but she couldn't stop. It gave her the control and direction she'd craved during the unsettled years of her childhood. "What's on it, then?" "Just the tattoo, so far." "One thing is not a list, babe." "I know, but change isn't going to happen overnight." Okay, Beck sighed. "So, what sort of tat? And where?" "Something small." "Very small." "Maybe a butterfly on my ankle." "Or your shoulder?" "Maybe a hip." "You could be really adventurous and go for a boob, something that just peeks out from your bra a little." Samantha gulped again. Just talking about it was making her sick. The appointment is in 3 days, so I have time to ponder." "Bravo. I'm proud of you, Sam. How's the job hunt going?" "Apparently I'm too overqualified for temp jobs, and I'm not interested in anything too permanent. I want to be able to go when Bob comes crawling back." "Of course. For what it's worth, I have a good feeling about today. I bet you're going to walk out your door, and the perfect job is just going to fall into your lap." Samantha stopped and stared at the transformation to Birdie's shop as she exited the building. It had been boarded up for the last 3 weeks, and Nick had been nowhere in sight. Trepidation had twisted her insides at the construction noise that could be heard daily. What was he doing? Didn't he know the charm of the place was its old worldliness? The musty smell of the pre-loved paperbacks, the rickety metal shelves, the beanbag corner, the lurid shag carpet that Birdie had installed after floods from the 70s had ruined the old one? Surely he wasn't going to modernize it, make it all shiny and new? Birdie had a cult following. Women came to her place for a dash of yesteryear. They came because they were romance junkies, and searching through Birdie's shelves never failed to turn up a gem. Birdie's was addictive. What if he wasn't going to continue with selling romance at all? What if he went totally modern and refused to stock them? What if he was some kind of literary snob who pooh-poohed the genre and was only going to sell new stuff? Was he going to totally alienate Birdie's faithful customers and ruin her wonderful legacy? And as she stood before the newly unveiled shop front, all her doubts of the last few weeks were confirmed. It was horrible. The simplicity of Birdie's clear glass had been replaced by the sophisticated elegance of a sleek, dark tint. The simple painted sign that had adorned the window for 50 years and read Birdie's second-hand romance bookshop was now a garish neon creation in ice blue. Beneath it, more neon.